So, King Charles pulled Camilla from her hosting role at one of the palace's biggest garden parties. And the strangest part isn't the removal itself. It's that nearly everyone inside those walls seemed to sense it coming, except the one woman who never should have been the last to know. The palace didn't shake because voices were raised. It shook because of how quiet it went. A single decision, made behind polished doors and layered under centuries of ceremony, reshaped the entire mood of the afternoon. And when you line up what was said against what actually unfolded, the sequence stops asking questions and starts giving answers. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button on Royal Decode so nothing about this story slips past you. Here's where it truly begins. Charles is alone at his desk, eyes fixed on the hosting list as though that single sheet of paper had somehow outweighed the crown itself. His hand lifts, then freezes. For anyone unfamiliar with royal tradition, a garden party is one of those long-standing customs where the monarch opens the palace grounds to invited guests. It's meant to project warmth, continuity, togetherness. This particular gathering had been designed to broadcast exactly that message: unity. Camilla was supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, smiling through the ceremony, welcoming attendees, showing the world that nothing behind palace walls had fractured. Because hosting isn't handshakes and pleasantries. It signals who holds the king's confidence, who receives the spotlight, and who occupies the closest ground to the throne. That's precisely what makes what happens next so heavy. Charles lowers his gaze to her name. Seconds pass in silence. Then the pen moves. He strikes her from the garden party hosting duties and hands the role to another senior figure within the royal circle. And under royal protocol, the framework of rank, order, and ceremonial conduct, that switch carried far more meaning than a simple calendar adjustment. This wasn't a last-minute reshuffle. This was a line drawn. This was the king declaring that the afternoon would not be allowed to turn into a platform for rivalry, ego, or private ambition. Camilla was told in a quiet sitting room, and her face shifted before her voice did. She held her posture, but the stillness was already bruised. When the aide finished delivering the news, she asked just one thing. Was this his decision? The aide replied carefully, saying the change came down to tone, optics, and internal control within the palace. Camilla caught every meaning. Tone was the atmosphere of the event. Optics was how the public would interpret it. Control meant Charles no longer had faith in the original arrangement. Behind that closed door, everything shifted. Charles hadn't pulled her aside to plug a hole in the schedule. He had issued a royal correction, and anyone standing close enough to feel the tremor understood that. But the sharpest cut was buried underneath. The real shock wasn't Camilla's removal at all. It was who Charles was actually trying to shield when he signed his name. And before the palace could fully absorb what had just been decided, the people at the heart of it were forced to confront what the decision revealed about their own standing beside the crown. Every royal move exists in two forms: the version written on paper and the version worn on the faces of those forced to live with it. For Charles, this was never simply a hosting swap. For Camilla, this was never just a lost public appearance. For William, it was a signal. And inside the palace, everyone grasped that a single garden party had exposed a wound running far deeper than any of them wanted to admit. Charles had learned long ago that composure could be more lethal than rage. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of speaking softly while the room quietly cracked around him. And now that same skill stood between him and the woman sitting across from him. To the outside world, the garden party looked like nothing more than an elegant afternoon on palace grounds where invited guests mingled with the family. But inside the monarchy, it carried much heavier weight. It was a public declaration of trust, of hierarchy, of belonging. Whoever stood at its center wasn't merely greeting people. They were being displayed as part of the institution's living core. And Camilla understood that perhaps too well. For her, those hosting duties had become proof that the long, brutal road of dismissal, criticism, and quiet resistance had finally reached its end. Standing beside Charles meant being seen, being embraced, being protected. So when he told her the plan had changed, the wound cut far deeper than the sentence itself. Charles didn't shout. He didn't accuse her of anything. He spoke with care, almost tenderness, and that gentleness hurt more than rage ever could. Camilla sat perfectly upright, her expression contained, but the ache leaked through the pauses between her breaths. Charles tried to frame it as protection of the day, of the guests, of the crown, from a public flare-up of private strain. Yet Camilla heard something far chillier underneath. She heard distance. She heard uncertainty. She heard her husband choosing the palace over her dignity. And when William stepped in later, cautious and reserved, the atmosphere shifted again. The prince didn't gloat. He didn't press the point further. But he could tell his father had already made peace with the truth. This decision might contain one public crisis, while quietly tearing open a far more personal one. William had seen the sealed palace memo before Camilla ever did. The document revealed that the hosting arrangement had been examined more than once, long before any public schedule was finalized, which meant the removal hadn't been an act of panic. It had been reviewed, weighed, and signed off. Camilla realized in that moment that while she had assumed her role was locked in, others had already been questioning it in rooms she wasn't invited into. Charles watched that realization spread across her face, and the room seemed to shrink around them both. The decision was made. The damage had begun. And still, the question burning quietly beneath every controlled expression was why Charles had finally moved now, after all these years of allowing Camilla to stand beside him. That answer wasn't sitting inside the garden party at all. It lived in a private moment days earlier, the moment when quiet tension curdled into royal consequence. The palace remembers certain moments not because they were loud, but because no one ever forgets what unfolded afterward. Days before the garden party ruling, a private luncheon became the spark everyone would later trace all the way back. A single sentence spoken, a chair dragged against the floor, one face turning to stone. And from that instant on, Charles knew the next public appearance could not go ahead as originally planned. Charles walked into that luncheon still convinced the final touches could be smoothed over gracefully. The meeting had been held in the palace breakfast room to finalize the order of greetings for the garden party, and everyone present understood how much that order mattered. Guest reception, meaning the planned sequence of which royal welcomes which group first, from foreign dignitaries to charity leaders to military families, sounded routine on the surface. It wasn't. Because in royal life, sequence becomes status, and status becomes power. Charles knew a single misplacement could quietly transform a polite afternoon into a silent declaration of who ranked highest in the family. Camilla noticed Catherine's placement before anyone spelled it out. For one segment of the event, Catherine had been positioned ahead of her in the receiving order, and that adjustment cut through the table like a warning shot. Camilla didn't erupt right away. She questioned it with a tight, restrained calm that made the room more uncomfortable than any outburst would have. Charles heard the edge sharpen in her voice, and the old dread crawled back into him. Not fear of scandal alone, but the fear that a private grievance was starting to push its way toward a public stage. William spoke gently, almost carefully, asking that the order stay untouched for the sake of the day. The prince understood that Catherine's placement wasn't an insult aimed at Camilla, but a quiet signal of continuity, a way to introduce the future before millions of eyes began dissecting every movement. Camilla heard something entirely different. She heard replacement. She heard a younger figure being elevated while she was being asked to accept less. Then she set her teacup down with enough force that every conversation in the room died at once. Nobody had to name the fracture. Everyone felt it. Charles's gaze moved from Camilla to William, and the silence became suffocating. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. Then perhaps the public should know who is really hosting this family. The words weren't shouted, but they landed with the danger of a struck match near dry parchment. Charles knew instantly that the garden party could no longer be trusted to remain ceremonial. It could turn into a confrontation hidden behind smiles. Charles closed the luncheon without drama, but the damage had already seeped into the walls. Once the others had left, he asked his aides to step out and remained alone with the hosting folder for close to 10 minutes. When he finally called his private secretary back inside, his decision had hardened into stone. That luncheon became the point beyond which nothing could be walked back. But the real confrontation didn't arrive until Camilla learned that Charles had actually acted on what he'd heard. And when the door finally sealed shut behind them, husband and wife were no longer talking about a garden party. They were staring down the limits of power itself. There are words a monarch can offer in public that a husband can barely bring himself to say in private. Charles had spent a lifetime perfecting restraint, but inside that room, restraint sharpened into a blade. Camilla came searching for reassurance. What she found instead was a decision already made, a document already signed, and a man unwilling to retreat from the most painful sentence of the day. Charles didn't stand when Camilla walked in. That detail alone told her everything a speech never could. He stayed behind the desk, exhausted in a way the crown could no longer disguise, with the revised garden party hosting sheet lying between them like evidence. A palace study isn't merely a private office. It's the kind of room where royal decisions take shape before they emerge as public reality. And this decision had already crossed that threshold. Her role had been reassigned. The order had been approved. The event, once meant to affirm her place, had become the stage of her removal. Camilla stood motionless for a moment, as if refusing to accept what the paper in front of her actually meant. Then the anger found her voice. She asked whether this was punishment, whether one sharp sentence at a luncheon had been enough to erase her from the heart of a royal event. Charles looked at her with the weariness of a man who understood that every possible answer would draw blood somewhere. He told her this wasn't punishment. He was shielding the monarchy from turning into a family quarrel played out in public. The words were measured, but they hit hard because Camilla understood exactly what they meant. He genuinely believed the threat was real. Camilla's anger didn't vanish. It fractured. Beneath it, sadness rose, silent and heavy. She had expected reassurance, maybe even an apology. Instead, Charles wasn't seeking her permission. He was informing her of what would happen. The hosting plan, the official arrangement that determined which royals greeted which guests and in what order, had already been rewritten. That mattered because royal order is never simply order. It tells the public who commands trust, who commands influence, and who must step back when the institution demands it. Charles finally admitted the warning that had pushed him further than Camilla had anticipated. Several senior figures had told him the garden party could become a visible power struggle if the original setup went forward untouched. They feared tension would leak through the smiles, that guests would sense the divide, that the cameras would catch what the palace was trying to bury. Camilla listened, wounded not just by the decision, but by the fact that others had been debating her place before she'd ever been given the chance to defend it. Then Camilla asked the question they had both been dancing around. Had William influenced him? Charles paused. He didn't offer a clean denial. He didn't hand her the comfort she was reaching for. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession. And in that silence, Camilla realized the decision was larger than one garden party, larger than one wounded pride, larger even than Charles's refusal to retreat. Behind it stood a deeper question of who truly controlled the presentation of the crown. And once Camilla understood that Charles wasn't acting alone in spirit, her attention shifted toward the hidden machinery of palace authority. Power inside the palace almost never announces itself. It moves through calendars, seating charts, receiving lines, and names printed slightly higher or slightly lower on a page. To the public, hosting a garden party may look graceful and effortless, but behind the gates, the order of greetings can expose hierarchy, trust, and warning. And this time, the paper trail was pointing somewhere Camilla hadn't seen coming. Charles knew the decision wouldn't stay locked in ink. The instant his name settled onto the final approval, the change stopped being a private preference. It became royal instruction. The garden party's hosting plan flowed through royal secretaries, household officials, security advisors, and the king's ultimate sign-off. Those roles mattered because a palace event doesn't run on charm alone. Every greeting line, every arrival time, every assigned position carries a message. Camilla had believed that message still placed her near the center. The revised order told a very different story. Charles reviewed the list with a stillness that unsettled the senior courtier beside him. That courtier had served long enough to recognize when silence meant pain, and he watched the king's hand slow as it neared Camilla's name before the pen moved on. The hesitation mattered. It made clear this wasn't a cold act, but a costly one. Charles wasn't simply rearranging a schedule. He was placing the public shape of the crown above the peace of his own household. And that choice gave the paper its weight. Garden party hosting was part of the crown's public choreography, meaning the arranged order through which the monarchy displays unity, rank, and trust to those watching. William understood that choreography with piercing clarity. In a quiet corridor conversation, the prince spoke to an aide with measured restraint, insisting the day had to remain dignified, not divided. He wasn't chasing triumph, he was chasing control. He knew Camilla's reduced role would be studied by everyone fluent in the language of royal signals. He also knew a single wrong gesture could turn discipline into humiliation. Still, the future king didn't retreat from the reality. The event had to serve the monarchy before it served anyone's pride. Camilla's removal ran deeper than the initial announcement had suggested. The revised hosting order shrank the pool of guests she could formally receive, cutting into her ceremonial visibility and narrowing the space where she could appear as a central figure. Then, a second document surfaced in the working file. It laid out contingency arrangements prepared well in advance, proving the palace had anticipated resistance long before Camilla had ever pushed back against the decision. Charles saw the final structure and grasped the danger. Documents could direct staff, they could shift names, they could control movement. But they couldn't control wounded pride once the news began drifting from office to office, from aide to aide, from whisper into silence. By the time the revised instructions traveled through the staff corridors, the palace was no longer preparing for a party. It was bracing for fallout. The first sign of collapse wasn't a public statement. It was a closed door. Camilla withdrew from the corridor with her expression composed, but those who saw her caught the shift instantly. The woman who had expected to greet guests beneath the palace trees was suddenly being told to step aside. And in royal life, being asked to step aside can feel far more brutal than being sent away entirely. Camilla walked away from Charles with the kind of control that only made the wound more visible. She didn't argue in the hallway. She didn't demand another audience. She simply slipped behind the nearest door and let the silence swallow what her pride refused to reveal. The revised hosting instructions had already begun flowing through the palace, shifting arrival times, reception positions, and the duties assigned to senior royals. Those instructions mattered because a garden party had never been just a pleasant afternoon. It was a public map of importance, and Camilla had just been moved away from that map's center. Staff received the update with careful faces and even quieter voices. They were told to treat the change as final, not temporary, and to avoid discussing it beyond the requirements of protocol. Protocol meaning the strict working rules that keep royal events tightly controlled, from who stands where to who speaks first. But rules couldn't soften the meaning. Camilla's role hadn't been postponed, it had been diminished. The palace was leaving no room for negotiation, and that alone told every aide that Charles had crossed an emotional line he couldn't easily walk back over. Camilla sat alone after leaving him, slowly slipping off her gloves and placing them on a side table, as if accepting the humiliation in pieces. The queen consort had endured years of judgment, but this felt entirely different. This came from inside the walls. This came from the man whose approval had once shielded her from the cruelest edges of royal life. Her sadness didn't crash in loudly, it settled heavily, because she understood that public grace almost always demands private pain. Charles stayed in his study long after the conversation ended, staring at the shut door well past the moment she had gone. The king was caught between personal loyalty and royal discipline, and neither side offered him any comfort. He had protected the event, but wounded the person closest to him. Then the next discovery hardened the mood of the palace further still. Aides realized Camilla's name had also been struck from a short internal briefing prepared for garden party photographers and guest marshals, the staff who guided attendees and managed the flow of the day. Charles understood exactly what that meant. The palace didn't just want her role reduced, it wanted zero confusion over who would visibly lead the event. And yet, the emotional weight of the decision hadn't fully settled until Charles and William spoke without advisors, titles, or protective distance between them. What followed wasn't a meeting of monarch and heir. It was a private reckoning between father and son. When Charles and William finally stood alone, the palace machinery vanished. No aides, no polished phrases, no formal witnesses to the truth. Only a father who had made a painful choice and a son who understood why that choice had become inevitable. Inside that private room, the garden party stopped being the real subject. The real subject was the future of the crown itself. Charles summoned William in after the revised hosting order had been completed, and that summons carried weight both men fully understood. This wasn't just another official briefing. A hosting order was the approved plan determining which royal figure greeted which guests and in what position during a public palace event. But for Charles, the document had become something far more personal. It had forced him to choose between the peace of his own marriage and the public steadiness of the monarchy. William entered quietly, not as a rival, but as a son who understood the cost of what his father had just done. Charles didn't pretend the choice had been simple. He confessed he had let the tension go unaddressed for too long, waited too long to correct it, believed too long that silence could contain what pride had already sharpened. The king knew Camilla would feel wounded, and that mattered because her place beside him had always meant more than ceremony. It had been proof of survival, proof that decades of rejection had finally given way to acceptance. Pulling her from the center of the garden party wasn't only rearranging a schedule. It struck at the meaning she had built around that role. William listened with careful restraint. The prince didn't look pleased. He didn't treat Camilla's removal as a personal win. Instead, he answered with the quiet force of a man who had watched this pressure build for years. Correction, he told his father, only stung this deeply because the silence had lasted far too long. The words landed hard, but they weren't cruel. They were simply true. William understood that public duty sometimes required a private wound. Yet he also knew wounds inside a royal family rarely stayed hidden for long. Charles then admitted the fear that had driven him forward. He believed the garden party could become a public symbol of competing influence if he let the original plan proceed. Guests would notice. Staff would sense it. The palace would keep smiling, but the fracture would breathe underneath every greeting. William promised he wouldn't exploit the outcome because the monarchy could not survive if private victories turned into public trophies. Charles looked at his son and saw not triumph, but restraint. That shifted the emotional tone of the entire day. Yet beyond the palace walls, the silence was already cracking, and the outside world was preparing its own verdict. And when the story finally reached the public, one image captured the meaning of the decision with more precision than any official statement ever could. By morning, the palace no longer owned the story. The public did. What had begun as a private hosting call became a national spectacle, stripped of its soft language and stretched beneath merciless headlines. People weren't just asking why Camilla had been removed. They were dissecting every photograph, every absence, every rearranged position, and one front page transformed palace silence into public verdict. Charles had wanted control, but that control evaporated the moment the first broadcast opened with his decision. The palace's response was brief, careful, and cold, describing the garden party arrangements as reflecting the king's wishes and the ceremonial needs of the occasion. That phrasing mattered because ceremonial needs referred to the public-facing duties that kept royal events orderly, dignified, and faithful to the image of the crown. But the explanation didn't extinguish the storm, it fed it. Viewers understood that when the palace reached for clean language, something far messier had almost always played out behind closed doors. Camilla watched the coverage from a private room, and every sentence seemed to remove her all over again. The screen replayed older moments where she had hosted with confidence, standing beside Charles as though her place had finally been sealed beyond doubt. Then the report cut back to the new arrangement, and the contrast was merciless. Camilla turned away before the segment ended. She had weathered public judgment before, but this felt different. This wasn't scandal arriving from the outside. This was the palace itself repositioning her, then asking her to endure the reshuffle in silence. Charles watched another news segment without speaking, his jaw tightening as broadcasters framed the decision as a rare, visible correction inside the royal household, focusing on his authority and Camilla's sudden absence from the hosting center. He knew the truth ran heavier than any coverage could carry. He had acted to prevent public embarrassment, and yet, the attempt to close one wound had opened another. The king had protected the event but exposed the fracture. Then came the image that locked the public mood into place. A major newspaper front page ran a wide photograph of the palace garden with an empty, marked space beside Charles, under the headline, "The King Hosts Alone." The words landed like a sentence handed down. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd formed, Not wild, not chaotic, but watchful. Visitors pointed at the front page, speaking in low voices about what Camilla's absence really meant, and whether this was a correction, a warning, or a quiet fall from favor. Charles knew headlines could never explain the full truth. Camilla knew they could still cut deep. Public reaction couldn't define the final meaning of the moment. That verdict belonged to what he chose, what she lost, and what the monarchy gained. When the noise finally faded, the true judgment wasn't printed in headlines. It was measured in the emotional cost paid behind palace walls. In the end, this was never really about a garden party. It was about the moment King Charles accepted that love, loyalty, and royal duty don't always travel in the same direction. Camilla lost a role she believed had confirmed her place. Charles lost the comfort of avoiding confrontation. William watched the monarchy choose discipline, and a crown revealed what it protects first. Charles walked into the day with a calm face and a heavy heart. He knew every greeting would be watched, every pause dissected, every absence measured against the story already burning beyond the gates. The garden party continued under the revised hosting order, the approved plan determining which royal figure receives guests and where each person stands throughout the event. That order mattered because royal life speaks through placement. Camilla no longer led the ceremonial welcome, and the king carried that decision through the crowd, smile after smile, knowing the private ache behind it hadn't loosened its grip. Camilla remained dignified, but dignity didn't erase the wound. She now understood that her removal wasn't a passing embarrassment or a small adjustment. It was a line drawn by Charles himself. The palace projected calm on the surface, but the altered arrangement made the message unmistakable. Royal duty had been placed above personal expectation, and for Camilla, that truth cut sharper than any headline. She had believed proximity to the throne meant protection. Instead, she learned that standing close to power isn't the same as holding it. Charles hadn't removed her to humiliate her. That was the final emotional revelation, and it cut deeper because it carried no cruelty. He removed her because allowing the tension to continue would have weakened the monarchy in public. The crown, meaning the institution of royal authority that endures beyond any single person, demanded order before comfort. Charles had ducked confrontation for as long as he could, but the garden party stripped that option away. He chose the institution. He chose the shape of the monarchy over the ease of his own household. William's quiet presence made the shift impossible to overlook. The prince didn't need a victory, and he didn't chase applause. His restraint revealed what the future would demand: control, discipline, and a refusal to let private conflict dictate public duty. William understood that the monarchy could survive pain, but not confusion. Charles understood it too, even as the cost pressed heavily between him and Camilla. The verdict was clear. Charles chose duty over comfort. Camilla learned that acceptance doesn't equal authority. William watched the crown defend itself with painful precision. The monarchy survived the day by sacrificing ease for order. The garden party ended, the gates closed, and the verdict remained unmistakable. The crown had spoken, and even those closest to it had no choice but to obey.